Hi everybody, Jim Ostrowski, back with the technical problem ridden Liberty Walking podcast. Well, in any event, the summer, not summer, but warm weather's here, at least in Buffalo, so I'm not going to slide away on the bike path. So this is kind of a test broadcast. I did some changes in the cell phone signal, see if it works. This is my third attempt to talk about the structure of the progressive state of America. I know that sounds very pretentious, but hey, the title fits. So the reason I'm talking about this, and probably keep this a little short today, is that this notion of, is there a Trump revolution going on, or is it sort of just some tinkering around with the progressive state of America? So in order to answer that question, we have to understand what the progressive state of America is. Now, it's true that progressivism comes in as a governing force in 1913 with that odious Woodrow Wilson, our worst president, worse than Abe. But the historical developments are important, and really a couple of developments I'll get into that happened significantly before 1913 laid the groundwork and made progressivism possible. But progressivism required some additional developments, ideological, political, whatever. So hopefully by the end of this podcast, you'll understand what the architecture or structure of the progressive state of America is, and that way won't take us too long to determine whether the MAGA revolution is a revolution or not, and whether it's going to sweep away the progressive state. So for just a word on the progressive state of America, that comes from the book Progressivism, a Primer, 2014. Even though it was written 11 years ago, it's not dated at all. It's fresh as a daisy. And if you really want to understand the history of the country and where the country is now, and whether the country's really going in a different direction, you have to read that book. It's on Amazon, like all my books. It's my leading best-selling book. If you want to support my work, buy my books. I don't accept donations. I might change that rule for a business idea that I have, but for purely political purposes, I don't accept donations. That way I remain independent, and I practice what I preach, which is free market, free enterprise. So I think it's only fair that I monetize my work product and make it available in the marketplace to provide some value and show how it's done. And I've been modestly successful at that. I'm going to be more successful in the future. So begin with the what does progressive state of America means? It means that it was a battery notice, not a signal interruption. It's my fault. I didn't charge my battery enough today, which means it's going to be a relatively short podcast. So we were set up as a federal republic with the states would be largely independent, except for a few functions done by the federal government. That's all obsolete. That's dead. That ended. I'll talk about when that ended. But we no longer are the United States. We're the United State and the progressive state of America. So America is self-explanatory. We know what that means. So let's go back to Declaration of Independence, 13 independent states, and we know they were independent because the Treaty of Paris, independent of each other and independent of the federal government. The Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War, 1783, says that it announces as part of the treaty that Great Britain recognizes that the 13 states of America, and they're all listed and delineated, are free and independent states. So that starts to change a little bit with the Articles of Confederation, but not so much. It kind of formalized the pre-existing arrangement. where it really wasn't a federal government. There was 13 state governments, and they met in committee, and they agreed to cooperate on certain things. But if they didn't cooperate on certain things, there really wasn't much the federal government could do, because there really wasn't much of a federal government. And the Articles of Confederation moved a bit towards the Constitution, but it didn't have a strong executive, and didn't have the direct power of taxation, and lacked a lot of other powers that the Constitution created. So here we go to the Constitution. Let's pick up there. The Constitution, although it didn't have an immediate effect in that regard, but the Constitution, and this is recognized by the anti-federalists of the time, the Constitution created a very powerful central government. Very powerful central government. Now, some of the people involved, like Madison, tried to argue later, it wasn't as powerful, but if you just look at the text, it creates a very powerful central government with the power to tax, the power to regulate commerce. If you give me the power to regulate your commerce, I basically own your ass. And that's a huge power. And it gave it power to raise armies, later interpreted to include conscription. If I can conscript you, I own your life. And none of the other rights you have mean anything if I can grab your body and put it in Vietnam and have a bunch of Vietnamese troops, kill your body. And then all the other rights that are in the Constitution mean nothing. So the Constitution laid the groundwork for a very powerful government, but ideologically, the country was still fairly libertarian, so it took a while for that to manifest itself, and in fact, you had an immediate counter-revolution. The election of 1800, which put Jefferson in power, and he made the government a lot smaller. He was not in the country when the Constitution was ratified. So that's the next big development. I don't normally have notes, and whenever I do have notes, it's certainly very general notes. So the next thing, let's go right to the Civil War. Civil War, really, so the first piece of architecture of the progressive state of America is the Constitution. You have to understand that. Trump is certainly not going to repeal the Constitution. Getting a little ahead of myself. But the second major piece of architecture comes with the Civil War, which the issue of secession is not clearly dealt with in the Constitution. I wrote a analysis of the Constitution arguing that secession is an implied power of the states, right of the states, but that's never really been resolved in a court of law or in the court of logic or fact, but it was resolved on the battlefield in the Civil War, and the general understanding is that no matter how much a state is abused by the federal government, the state can never leave. So without the threat of leaving, given the natural tendency of power to centralize and be abused, the states are really, the federal government's bitch. So that's the second piece of architecture of the progressive state of America. I don't hear anything from the Trump administration about, we need to amend the Constitution to allow states to secede. Although certainly states should have the right to secede, and we could talk about that some other time. Everybody should have the right to secede, right down to the block level. Ludwig von Mises was right about that. The libertarians have been right about everything since 1650. So what else do we got? Lincoln starts to, in addition to that one big addition of federal power, Lincoln really starts to put together what would later become the nightmare that we have today, which is this progressive big government, which has this enormous power over everything and dominates our life and has really been in the active process of ruining the country since at least the 1970s. And this decline has been palpable. And if you haven't noticed, it's because you're not fucking paying attention. So suspension of habeas corpus, conscription, the first conscription law, the American system, tariffs, which Trump loves, by the way. You go back and look at this history, there's a lot of things that remind you of what's happening right now. The American system, paper money, internal improvements, and which is pork barrel project or corporate welfare, and the tariff, of course. And Trump says the most beautiful word in the English language. I think it's hardly true, but inflation, fiat money. Lincoln subsidized the railroads. That was the popular form of pork barrel project at the time. And the first income tax, it was temporary, but the first taste of the income tax. Now, land-grant colleges, Department of Agriculture, which we still suffer from. Suppression of free speech. He threw people in jail for free speech. And we get our first passports. Which is, again, there's echoes of Trump. Although Trump didn't start the passport laws, he certainly believes in them and is trying to enforce them as much as possible. And you get total war in the Civil War, which is a feature of progressivism. Is very warlike. There's so much material here. I'm trying to talk fast, but I may not get through this. But no signal interruptions so far, which is good. So overall, intensified the centralization of power initiated by the Constitution, and also banking, the beginning of sort of the banking regulations, which leads ultimately to the Fed. So, and you get the 14th Amendment, another form of centralized federal power. So, but overall, though, what happens is, and I'll try to move a little quicker on this so I get done before I run out of batteries. There's a bit of a counter-revolution. Ultimately, for example, with Grover Cleveland, things calmed down a little bit, and the government didn't really continue to grow drastically. In fact, the overall size of the government declined. Spending, and of course, always declines after a major war. Spending declined, and things got back to sort of a Jeffersonian type of model, with always the potential of a Hamiltonian seizing power. So that Hamiltonian finally comes along with Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Here's your first big time. Lincoln was a proto-progressive, but your first actual, designated, unambiguous progressive is Woodrow Wilson, and he is your worst president by far. Talk real quick about some of the crap that he pulled. With Wilson, you get the income tax permanently. You get the Federal Reserve permanently. You get the war on drugs permanently. You get World War I, which causes a sort of centralization of power over the economy. That's one of the side effects of war. War grows the state. A lot of the bad domestic policies that we have first got their start during various wars. I won't go through that now. It's another subject. Massive suppression of civil liberties like Lincoln. And the first actual statute for passports. Lincoln had an emergency order, but the first actual statute. So all this stuff that Trump is doing now, far from being anti-progressive, the whole notion of deporting people because they don't have the proper paperwork, that's all Woodrow Wilson, that's all progressivism, so obviously none of that's changing. We go right on to FDR. I'm going to move pretty quickly through this because I think I'm already sort of making my point, and I don't want to run out of batteries. FDR, you get Social Security, World War II, again, war has caused a massive increase in government power, and although war spending declines after the war, as Robert Higgs has stated, the government's always bigger after war than it was before the war. This has been true of the Civil War, it's true of World War I, it's true of World War II. Unemployment, welfare, securities regulation, labor regulation, minimum wage, and more banking regulation. Fiat money, he seized the gold, and public housing, the great disaster we know and apparently the Republicans love because they're not getting rid of HUD. So then we got LBJ, an odious progressive president. He gives us socialized medicine, Medicare, Medicaid, $1 trillion each. Welfare, it's about $1 trillion. Federal welfare, we had local state welfare previously. Food stamps, student loans, HUD. And then Carter gives us the Department of Education. Obama gives us Obamacare. I'm going through this rather quickly for all the reasons I've stated. So here's the question for the Trump people. That's the architecture of the structure of the progressive state of America. Constitution, Lincoln, no secession, the various federal programs that Lincoln started, Wilson, passports, FDR, Social Security and other things, and LBJ, socialized medicine. Obama increases the degree of socialized medicine. So here's the question. Which of these programs has Trump gotten rid of? None. Which of these programs is slated for elimination in the budget bill that Trump passed through the House? The Senate hasn't acted on it yet. Now we've got the continuing resolution. You can add that in, all approved by Trump. Which of these programs that's on the table for passage or about to be passed eliminates any of the progressive architecture of that I've talked about? And the answer is zero. So let's go on to the next question. And we're getting near to the end here, which is, what are they talking about getting rid of? Well, they're talking about getting rid of the Department of Education, but not really. No move has been made in that direction as far as I know. And they're really not talking about getting rid of the Department of Education. They're talking about moving it to the states. So that is not getting rid of the Department of Education. But really, all the action and most of the action with respect to education is at the state level. And even though I wrote a book about this, the Republicans could eliminate government schools in 22 or 23 of the states that they control without having a single Democratic vote. Nobody is proposing that they do that. In fact, my book was essentially ignored by any Republican who would otherwise claim to be against socialism and for school choice and all that bullshit. So I think I'm going to kind of end it there. I had a pretty good experiment here in not losing my signal, which is good. Going to be doing a lot more podcasts because I've gotten a little bit ahead of some of the legal work, which has been plaguing me, and plus I don't have to worry about falling on treacherous ice on the bike path. Although I'm fit as a fiddle at 63, it's unpleasant to be walking on ice when you're trying to focus on a podcast. So I'm going to leave it there. Thanks for watching, everybody. Much, 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 much more to come.